The story you are about to hear is a compilation of documented true facts featuring historical characters, events, or places that has played a role in shaping history. Please sit back and listen as I recite this narrative for you. Aren't vampires supposed to only be found in Transylvania? Then how did vampires come to be found in the good old US of A? It all began in some unfortunate New England villages as tuberculosis, then called consumption, ravaged entire families and communities. This bacterial lung disease, which spreads easily among family members, has horrid symptoms, giving feverish sufferers an ashen appearance and sunken eyes. In some cases, blood would drop from their mouths. It was a slow, wretched death, almost as if the life was gradually being drained out of them. It earned the name consumption for the way it caused dramatic weight loss. So severe was the epidemic that it claimed around 2% of the region's population from 1786 to 1800 and eventually killed perhaps 25% of the East Coast's citizens. No one understood how diseases spread back then. All they knew was that as consumption victims perished, their surviving family members would begin to fall ill one by one. Neighbors would be afflicted too. Adding to its mystery, consumption seemed capricious in choosing its victims. Some families escaped intact while others were thoroughly decimated. In 1892, the Brown family of Exeter, Rhode Island gathered together in the local graveyard. They were there to bury their mother who had just died of tuberculosis. Within a few months, her daughters Mary and Mercy and son Edward had contracted the disease and died as well. The fact that most of the family died in quick succession raised the suspicions of people in the community. Fearing that one of the people who had died was returning as a vampire, they persuaded the remaining Browns to exhume the bodies and looked for signs of vampirism. Once the bodies were unearthed, they noticed that Edward and Mary both had gone through the expected decomposition process, but young Mercy's corpse still looked fresh. To the people of Exeter, this was undeniable evidence that Mercy was a vampire and would soon return to drain the life from the people of the town. So Mercy's chest was cut open and her heart removed and burned. The ashes were then mixed with water and given to her brother to drink to protect him from the influence of the undead. But it doesn't seem to have worked as he too wasted away and died a few months later. However, the case of Mercy Brown was hardly an isolated incident, nor was it the first one of its kind. Instead, it was simply a minor part of a panic that was sweeping the region. Dubbed the New England Vampire Panic by the national press, the fear of vampire attacks rapidly consumed communities in the area. It's odd to think that in a time shortly after a period known as the Enlightenment, where science and reason became a serious force in public life, New Englanders could be so convinced that vampires were prowling around their houses at night. But in many ways, the area where the vampire panic occurred was a fertile breeding ground for this kind of superstitions. Unlike the rest of New England, a place of strong Puritan traditions, the more rural communities in the area held on strongly to some unorthodox beliefs. They frequently did things like hanging horseshoes in windows to ward off evil and visiting miracle healing springs. Many historians have suggested that the idea of the vampire is probably rooted in a disease called tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, or TB, is a bacterial infection that targets the lungs, and as the disease progresses, the person affected begins to cough up blood. Over time, they grow weak and pale. This is why it was often called consumption during the 19th century. It looked as though the disease was literally consuming the patient from the inside, and tuberculosis is often highly infectious. So people staying in a house with someone who had tuberculosis were very likely to contract the disease as well. You'll notice that those symptoms are very similar to those of someone who was supposed to be suffering from the influence of a vampire. And it's likely that most of the stories of vampires are actually the result of misunderstanding of what causes tuberculosis. It's easy to imagine how that would happen. Someone contracts tuberculosis and dies. Within a few weeks, the other people in the house begins to waste away as though the life were being drained out of them. It fits the narrative of a vampire very well. And this is probably what was behind the New England vampire panic. At the time when panic was most severe, the mid-19th century, New England was suffering from frequent and widespread tuberculosis outbreaks. This is an obvious explanation for why people in the region suddenly felt like vampire attacks were becoming more frequent. In addition, the Civil War had left the area devoid of young men, and the communities were rapidly dying due to the fact that there were very few people to tend the local farms. As a result, the bonds that connected these communities were breaking. The psychological strains that these factors put on the people of the region made them more receptive to the idea that vampires were attacking their families. Combined with the already prevalent superstitions about vampires, all of these factors created the perfect environment for a vampire attack to take root. Hey everyone! I just wanted to express how grateful I am that you took the time to listen to my narration. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I am Twisted Mind, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Salamat! Shoutout nga pala kay Natiktilaok Stories, Malikmata, Pinoy Horror Encounters, Greenwork Stories, Roger Roach TV, Haplos ng Nginig, Mischievous Being, Dark Hub PH, Sandatang Pinoy Horror Stories, Mark Barranco 1527, Eriza Miguel, Aubrey Delgado, and Abigail Sofia. Maraming salamat po.